You are listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the 1985 animated sci-fi 3D film, Starchaser, The Legend of Orin. Here we go. Got all my notes on, we are talking about Star Wars. That's right, Pete? Star Wars, is that right?
Yeah, it's an animated Star Wars from my best recollection.
Feels a little bit like that. And if folks don't know what we're talking about, they'll hear about it because they're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of the hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, co-host extraordinaire, Pete Charbonneau. And Pete, I guess maybe disappointing to many of people, we are not talking about the actual movie Star Wars. We are taking them back to 1985 to talk about a movie that was released after A New Hope, after Empire, and after Return of the Jedi. We're talking about Starchaser, The Legend of Orin.
The mightiest villain in the universe fears only one. You, the heroic boy who can defy him. The adventure awaits you. The excitement surrounds you with the incredible sensation of 3D like you've never seen it before. Starchaser, The Legend of Orin in 3D, rated PG.
If you have been listening to the last few episodes of the Fan2Fan Podcast, one, I guess thank you first and foremost. And two, our attempt to watch 3D movies released in the 80s. And we're talking classics like Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin, Parasite, Silent Madness, Rottweiler, aka Dogs of Hell, Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone coming at you, Treasure of the Four Crowns, Tales from the Third Dimension in 3D, Gremloids, aka Hyperspace, which may have a mention on this episode, Pete, because I think there's maybe a little Venn diagram there with all the Star Wars love.
Be some Star Warsian influences on that one as well.
So this movie, Pete, was it a movie that you were even aware of before we decided to take on this 3D summer?
No, and I feel I'm saying that a lot on these last bunch of episodes. No recollection of it being in the theater, no recollection really of it at all. I was intrigued to see what the first animated 3D release was going to be and going to be like. And I can say I have seen it, and it was a movie, and it was animated. And I assume it was in 3D.
I assume too, all the above, Pete. And I think this is the fun part about this, right? We watched Coming at Ya, spaghetti Western that gets everything going in 1981. Like you mentioned, first time watch. And we had so many first time watches, Silent Madness, Rottweiler, Gremloids, movies that were somewhat surprising. And sometimes like Silent Madness, how did that get past us? Because we've watched so much. This one, again, like this comes out in 1985. After those movies have been released, it's really like equal parts 80s 3D, but it's also really prompted because of the success of Star Wars. And I think this is one where, since you've talked about how Star Wars, it made such a big influence on you when you were growing up, movies that we talked about on other episodes, you did see Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin, and Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, two movies that had to have also been influenced by Star Wars. You saw those in theaters. You didn't see Starchaser in theaters, but did you see Star Wars, A New Hope, or any of the sequels in the theater?
Oh, sure. I think I've talked about this, but I was in my pajamas at the Smith Haven Drive-In in the summer of 1977 to see the original Star Wars.
Wow.
Lost my almost 5-year-old mind as I was on the playground at the drive-in, and once, back then before the movie was starting, they do a little flash of the lights on the playground to let you know that the movie was about to start. And I was in, I had like the plastic footy pajamas. And once the lights started flashing, I started screaming at my parents, like, we gotta get to the car. And, running across the gravel lot to get to our family station wagon was, might be the fastest that I've ever run. So, and that was before I had ever even seen it. Like I somehow, the hype had hit me, and I knew that this was something that I had to see. And like many people, changed, the trajectory of my young life and my creative life, I would say, for sure. So, saw all the original trilogy in the theater. I think I've seen every Star Wars movie in the theater. Yeah. I'm always down for a Star Wars ripoff. I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing to crib from something that inspired so many people. So I talked about Space Hunter and Metal Storm the destruction of Jared Sin, while I think certainly Metal Storm, the destruction of Jared Sin, left me wanting at the end.
There was no destruction. There was no destruction.
They scratched an itch for my 10, 12-year-old self at the time. But, and I mentioned this on a previous podcast as well, I didn't go home and start to play any of those movies. It was always friends would come over, we'd go into the woods across the street, or we'd find some lot of woods in our neighborhood, and we'd be playing Star Wars. It was always Star Wars. None of the other ones were able to break through that dome because they just were inferior. So again, like I didn't necessarily know going into Starchaser that it was going to be so derivative of Star Wars. But it turns out that, yes, it is, to the point where you and I will routinely with our 80s 3D extravaganza kind of go through and mark the scenes that we feel were definitely made for the 3D
That's right.
experience and have our running list. I stopped keeping track of the 3D and started keeping a list of like just blatant Star Wars references instead. So I switched it up a little bit and went that route because, the first few, it's kind of like, oh, okay. Yeah. Mos Eisley, Desert Planet. Yeah, I get it. The Han Solo archetype. Yep. Lightsaber. And then all of a sudden went into, okay, you've got like a Death Star torture droid. You've got the detention block. They literally say light speed, tractor beam, ion engines. There's even like a Darth Maul cut in half thing at the end going on. So it's but that was before Darth Maul. Hats off, Starchaser. You predict the future there.
I think when you said hype, that's the word that is kind of hard to almost comprehend now. New Hope is 77. And when these movies came out, the ripples that they had, I think, in pop culture, it's hard to look at it now. You almost have to watch YouTube footage of kids and adults walking out of theaters, and you see that expression of exuberance, excitement. Like you said, their minds have been blown because they'd never seen anything like this before. And you have to imagine every kid who had a subscription to Starlog, and this was it, a swashbuckling and adventure, better than you could ever imagine to have ever seen type effects. The hype of Star Wars, it's so big that there was a toy released that literally was just the promise of a toy. It's just a piece of cardboard, basically to appease parents to say, yes, we know we couldn't figure out the demand for this in time, so we couldn't have the toys made. So you get to buy a piece of cardboard and you get to give this to your kids on Christmas. Sometime later, you'll get the toys. I mean, that was the hype.
Star Wars figures. R2-D2. Chewbacca, Luke, and Princess Leia. They're the Star Wars Early Bird set of figures. These action figures are not yet available, but this Star Wars Early Bird certificate package is in stores with this colorful Star Wars picture display stand and certificate to send in to get a set of figures by mail. They'll be sent to you at home between February 1st and June 1st. The Star Wars Early Bird certificate package, new from Kenner.
And also, I think, again, it might be difficult for people of a younger generation to fully grasp when we talk about the information black hole that there was back then too. When Star Wars was such a huge hit, it wasn't necessarily a given that you're going to get a trilogy or sequels. George Lucas may or may not have been talking about that. He may not have been writing with that in mind, but we certainly weren't overly aware of it. Not that you would be now, without the internet, without a lot of mass media to give you the information. It really came out in just like drips and drabs. And I distinctly remember my cousins coming over with either, I don't know if Star Wars Insider was around then, but it was either an issue of that or it might have been Starlog, where they had a location shot from Empire Strikes Back. I don't even think the movie was like named at that point, but it's just like Star Wars sequel filming now. And I remember seeing the picture, and it was something depicted on Hoth, so snow, and I got goosebumps just seeing that picture, because that's all that you were going to get until maybe the trailer dropped a year, 2 years later, and that's all you had to just hold on to that. And if you didn't have the actual magazine, as I didn't, because my cousins left with it, I had to hold that vision in my head of that image that I saw and be like, so what is this going to entail? Okay, so there's snow. What is this? What does this all mean? And to have to wait for Empire to come out to then see what's the correlation, what's the connection, and in the story that was being told. you just didn't have that information that you do now. Like you can go into pretty much any movie and have the whole thing spoiled if you want now. I think it's actually kind of hard to go in and not have it spoiled just if you're perennially online like so many of us are. So just a different world back then, and the hype factor of lines around the corner because there weren't as many multiplexes. So you'd go to your local theater that maybe they'd only have one movie. If you were lucky, it might be a triplex. Like we had the Lowe's triplex in Stony Brook. That would be show 3, but still, like I could remember driving in to see Empire and Return of the Jedi with my parents and pulling into the shopping center, seeing the line literally around the entire shopping mall and being like, well, we're definitely not making it into this one. So we'll come back later and try for the next showing. It's just wild to think about because we don't have these problems now for the most part. I mean, you might encounter a sold out show, but you can usually find that out from the comfort of your own couch before you head to the theater. Yeah, just a completely different world and different generation of hype building up to it. And then you've got something like this, Starchaser, The Legend of Orin, that was clearly influenced. And I believe the director and producer happily said that they were clearly influenced by it. I think this movie took 3 years to get made from a little bit of research that I was able to do. So comes out in 85, conceived in 82 before Return of the Jedi comes out. So it's in the midst of that original run hype. And it's like, well, let's take advantage of it. Although it comes out 2 years after Return of the Jedi, still very much conceived and in production during that height of the initial Star Wars mania.
And especially for an animated movie. So you can imagine the pre-production would take a bit longer. But I think this is where the impact that Star Wars had on kids that grew up in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't just limited to kids like you and to your cousins. You get all of these filmmakers, producers that see the hype of Star Wars. And then we got to be the beneficiary of other movies. Because then in 78, I know you're a big fan of that, you get Battlestar Galactica. Gets released. And, that blows our minds, especially when the TV series starts, because now you're watching Star Wars on TV. You don't even have to go to the mall and stand in that line. You can watch this on Friday nights on your TV that's about the size of a small Civic. But then Battle Beyond the Stars in 1980, the Roger Corman film, and knowing anything about Corman, of course, he would have jumped at the opportunity of writing the hype of Star Wars to make a Star Wars-like movie, a movie that we've talked about many times that your dad loved, 1980's Flash Gordon. When you look at it in hindsight, I have to think that movie is only greenlit for production because someone says, well, if Star Wars worked, let's kind of do Star Wars, but off center and do it our way. And Flash Gordon certainly is quirky and, it's very much its own movie. Metal Storm, like we talked about, The Destruction of Jared Sin, and Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, both in 83, that you were able to get in line with and get seats at for both. Ice Pirates in 84, always Space Herpes always has to get a mention. Gremloids Hyperspace, produced by Earl Owensby, that's 84. And that's more like the Spaceballs tone, where it's a bit of a parody. Doesn't always succeed, but Lord Buckethead does make every attempt. And then, like you mentioned, in that group picture, Starchaser in 85, after Star Wars, after some of these films, before Spaceballs in 87, it's still kind of there in the ether. Folks still want more. Then you get something like this. And I think especially the best part about this is, since it was a first time watch for you, and I watched it a few years ago, and I just looked at it exactly like you did. How was a lawyer not involved? Because the Star Wars references in this are pretty blatant at times. How is this not a movie that you hear about that, the animated movie that was sued that no one can ever find, but it's a bootleg at comic conventions here and there. But nope, this was released. It certainly didn't have the impact because we don't talk about it like we do Star Wars or even Flash Gordon.
Definitely not. And it sounded like from a release standpoint, they ran into some troubles. I'll probably reference this throughout this episode, but I've been doing some digging after watching it. I did come across an interview that was done on toplessrobot.com, conducted by Matthew Chernov. And he was able to track down back in 2015, Stephen Hahn, who is the director and producer of Starchaser, as well as Jeffrey Scott, who was the screenwriter. He did a really great job of just doing fairly lengthy Q&A with the both of them about the production of this film that I really colored in a lot of questions that I had at the end of watching this, and answering some of your questions as well. But it sounds like they had like a deal with a company that was going to distribute it and release it. That company filed for bankruptcy right before they were going to have this hit theaters. So it didn't really get the marketing. We've heard this. This is a tale as old as time. It didn't get the marketing that it needed to really take off. It sounded like they spent a lot of their own money. Which one? Stephen Hahn owns an animation company or owned an animation company.
Yep. In South Korea, I read somewhere.
Yeah, in South Korea. So this was like an American-Korean co-production. And he talks about how he had people working on it in the States, people working on it in South Korea. They're basically flying animation cells and stuff back and forth. Like, again, this is pre-internet. So it's not like you can just log on and just go over and just share files. So this became a very expensive production very quickly. And I think it fell through the cracks a little bit, probably because it didn't get the marketing that it needed. But also it's really, really derivative. It's a bizarre in many ways film because it's kind of a kid's movie, but we'll get into this. There's a weird sexual fetish with female robot asses in this that I was.
Yes, there is.
First instance, I was just kind of like, that's interesting. And
for a movie that was rated PG.
Yes, and this was rated PG.
Yes. And I think this is the misnomer for a lot of these animated movies, right? People assume cartoon animated equals for kids. And this certainly does not feel like it is for kids. It has bloodshed, death, very blatant sexual suggestions in the movie. In its style and certainly in its content reminded me more of like Heavy Metal and Fire and Ice. That's what this feels more like. So if you've never seen this, think less kid Star Wars and definitely think something a little bit more mature.
You've got robots calling each other sons of bitches. And
yes, exactly.
And, I think you're spot on. It reminded me in many ways, animation wise and tone, with Heavy Metal, but like on a much lighter scale. So I guess you could call this hair metal instead of heavy metal.
Well, you mentioned robots. You mentioned robots. And I think that's like the weird mashup of this is that movies like Krull and Masters of the Universe, they have that hybrid universe where magic and technology and science live. So this is kind of like that, where like in Star Wars, where you get the idea that the Force is maybe a religion or something that some people believe in, versus like in He-Man, where the cartoon, let alone the movie, mashed those two together and did that. Krull, same thing. That world feels like there's as much magic as there is spaceships in there. So it tries to do something that's not just straight up sci-fi or fantasy.
Yeah, for sure. And as far as the plot goes, it's nothing that hasn't been done before a million times. It's very much, young male hero's journey, discovering their place in this world as uprising leader, savior of a oppressed people that are, believe that the world that they inhabit is like the only world. And he kind of breaks free and discovers that there's many other worlds. Some of them, I think, again, I think animation wise, there's some interesting things going on here. I liked a lot of the background. The reason I stopped counting the 3D instances after like the beginning, when you've got like the laser whip at the camera by the Stormtrooper / Cylon robot daddy.
If you're going to steal from the best.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's steal from the best and just pack them together into one. I'm going to date myself with this reference here, but what if we put a Courageous Cat logo on their chest?
There you go. Totally works.
Do it.
Like a lot of animated films that we've watched that always are in that magical length of like an hour and 26 minutes, maybe an hour and 32 minutes. This one's an hour and 47 minutes, $14 to $15 million budget. I like context. So just to give you a sense for what we got on screen, 1981's Fox and the Hound. That was a Disney movie. That was $12 million. 1982's Secret of NIMH. That was $7 million.
Wow.
1985's Black Cauldron. That was $44 million. So that seems to be a big outlier for Disney. A lot of money spent there. But then on the opposite side of the spectrum, 1985, the Care Bears movie, somewhere between $2 and $4.5 million. Again, knowing very little. If you have maybe models and folks that have worked on Care Bears, the TV series, maybe it's easier for them to then pivot and just work on the movie, and that saves them money. But nevertheless, 1986, a year after Starchaser, American Tail, $9 million. So in that group picture, if you take out Black Cauldron, Starchaser is still a pretty pricey production. And then when you compare it to other movies that were released in 1985, Goonies, $19 million budget. Back to the Future, also $19 million. And Gremlins, $11 million. E.T. was $10 million. So even in that group picture, 1985, Starchaser is more expensive and kind of longer, almost about the length of some of those movies.
I would say from the animation standpoint, it's certainly a step above what you would see on TV at the time. There's a little more fluidity to the characters. I was originally thinking, like certainly the human characters look like they were rotoscoped. Again, referencing back to that Topless Robot article, they were in fact not rotoscoped, although I believe Ralph Bakshi, one of his acolytes or someone that worked with him was brought in, or Bakshi might have been an advisor to this. But apparently that was all, those are all animated without using rotoscoping. So that was impressive.
Like I mentioned, Heavy Metal, but Fire and Ice, which was a Ralph Bakshi rotoscope film, just like that Lord of the Rings movie, Rock and Roll and Wizards, all kind of movies of that era that, had adult content that weren't like Disney type of movies. But yeah, this had, I'm surprised that this actually wasn't rotoscoped, because there were times where it just looked like Fire and Ice. So I just kind of assumed, well, maybe some scenes, yes, some scenes, no.
Yeah, same. I think, again, just from this article that I read, I think most of the budget came into the fact that they were operating in two hemispheres to put this together. I feel like if this was all done in South Korea or the United States, I'm only guessing, but I would say that the budget would have been in that 7 to 10 million range instead. I
did read how the director did mention that because it was in 3D, not only did it delay the movie by 2 years, and you mentioned that earlier, instead of that 83 release, you get the 85 release, but that ballooned the budget because I guess they had to go back and redo some animation to kind of make it fit for 3D. To quote him, the 3D aspect doubled the amount of shooting. There were often mistakes, some requiring retakes that normally wouldn't have been necessary on a flat animated picture. And I know we're seeing this all in hindsight. I'm just wondering if the tide, the energy of Star Wars, would it have made sense to release it in 83 going against Jedi? Maybe, maybe not. But maybe 2 years later, would they have benefited? Like, guys, you can give yourself less work and make this cheaper and have it come up faster if you just don't do the 3D, especially when two podcasters in the very far-flung future are just going to tell you how we didn't really see the 3D that much to begin with. So sorry, guys.
Yeah. Although, I would be curious to see this in 3D, because I feel like with the cells kind of overlaid over each other, especially with the backgrounds and the way some of the ships are moving.
Sure.
And I think some of that might have been that computer animation being used for the first time. Feel like there would be some really interesting depth of field with the 3D with this. There's not a lot of like stuff that we've talked about with like Parasite and things where it's animation like thrown at the screen at you. It really seems to be more of like an immersive experience. And maybe that's the way that it was intended. Of course, we won't know that because we can't view it in 3D.
I'm going to burst your bubble, though. I did see how it was not put on Blu-ray until 2018. So just a few years ago, but unfortunately, I guess that release was disappointing because it was not in 3D. It was mono and there were no extras. So for a movie that came out in 85, but even when it was released, I saw like it had a VHS release, a Laserdisc release, something that, I don't know if you've ever heard this, it's some obscure format called VHD. Okay,
no.
Same. I had no clue what it was. And that was that was released in 3D. And then there was an out of print MGM DVD released in 2005. That's it. Since that was out of print, 2018 one. And this is kind of unlike Treasure of the Four Crowns that we talked about with Austin Trunick, for folks who don't know, the man who wrote the volumes on Canon Films. And we saw the Raiders of the Lost Ark wannabe Treasure of the Four Crowns. And when they're literally throwing turkey vultures and arrows at the screen, it's easy for Pete and I to get excited about this because we get excited about everything. But Austin, who's a Canon diehard, is like, oh, it was okay. But when Vinegar Syndrome or Severin, one of those boutique labels, released Treasure, and it's got the 3D glasses, and Austin was able to see it the way it was in some ways intended to be watched, then the movie kind of lives up to the promise that, yes, it's a kind of a gimmick, but this makes the experience a bit more passable. I think this movie, if it was released in 3D, would be amazing for everything you said. There are enough things here with depth of field, with sci-fi effects, laser blast, and laser whips and spaceships, where it feels like there would be a lot of stuff there that would look very cool on a 3D screen.
I think so. I mean, it sounds like in many ways like this, from the production to the attempts to release it later, it's just this whole thing is a bit of a mess, and I'm curious as to maybe there's just not a ton of demand out there for it to like really make it worth the while to give it a proper release now. But it's a bit of a shame because again, like I don't have a burning desire. Like if I never see this film in 3D, I'm not going to lose a whole lot of sleep over it. But
sure. Yep.
just from an interest standpoint, I would be curious as to see how it looked. And that could even just, be a couple of scenes and I'll be good and be like, okay, great. Thanks.
Since this was your first time watching this, did you enjoy this movie, Pete?
I was entertained at parts. I wouldn't say mouth agape at parts because that's too strong of a reaction. But like you mentioned, there's death. There are two deaths that occur within like the first 10 minutes of this film. One you kind of see coming. It's still a little out there, but then the second one, I was just kind of like, I thought this was going to be a main character.
Yep. And now, just for folks that haven't seen it, because again, we're going to throw the spoilers out there. Is the first one? Are you talking about Orin's? The grandpa. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, there's not even the one person that gets buried by the rubble.
That's right. Yeah. Yep. The second death, were you thinking was Elon, Orin's girlfriend, that gets strangled? Yes. Okay. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Because you think at that point they live in mine world, in this world that literally is a mine, and they've never seen the surface. And what's the comment one of the guys says is like, we never dig up, right? Like you only dig down.
Up is hell or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So when Orin gets this crazy idea to go to the surface and his girlfriend goes with him, and then all of a sudden the villain that pops in, the poor man's Darth Vader in Zygon, chokes her to death. It's rated PG, but you just saw literally someone strangled.
Right. And I kept expecting her like to still be alive. I thought like, we should, okay, we established that. Yeah.
You and the 8-year-old kid who was in the theater in 1985. Dad, Mom, is she coming back? Yeah, she's going to come back later. Oh, you sure? Yeah.
And again, this is now like the third death. I said second, but it's really the third because someone gets buried by a mine collapse early. And I'm just kind of like, you see their legs twitching under the rocks and then they stop. And I'm like, okay. And then Grandpa gets literally whipped in the eyes with the laser whip and has like these just nasty red lines around his eyes and his neck. And he's dead after he, correct me if I'm wrong, if you heard differently, Bernie, but I believe he says at one point that he's been digging in the mine for 70 years.
Yes.
Which immediately, like, when did this guy have time to start a family? And how do you make that happen? And how do you dig these red crystals day after day for 70 years? Like the stamina that Grandpa had, and then to just go out with a laser whip to the face felt a little shortchanged for Grandpa.
And he makes a comment at some point where somebody says, I think it's Elon, Orin's girlfriend, who basically says, you don't have to keep digging as hard as you do, Grandpa. And then also to Orin, who seems to be kind of making up the difference for what Grandpa can no longer keep up with. But then, like you said, Grandpa makes the comment like, yeah, I've been doing this for 70 years. And if I slow down, like I might as well just die. Lines like that, sentiments like that, getting whipped across the eyes. It just hits you early on that this is not meant for a young crowd.
Yes. You've already got some Star Wars references. We get a Temple of Doom reference because the mine, all these trapped humans are basically digging these red crystals that then get loaded into a giant cart that gets trekked into a giant mouth that just very much looks like the Thuggy Castle from Temple of Doom. I was expecting Mola Ram to come out. And they're all like in fear of it because, he comes walking out of the flames and, what's on the other side of the flames. We find out shortly after that because Orin, our erstwhile hero, who we keep seeing like kind of being slightly rebellious, like he won't kneel when everyone else kneels. He's, protecting his brother or sister who's blind, is helping Grandpa. Elon kind of takes care of herself until she gets choked to death. But, they very well established that, okay, he's kind of like the rebel who's like just, the paragon for goodness. It's very obvious that he's going to be the one that, he discovers this hilt of a sword and it's alive.
If in the distant future someone hears these words, perhaps it is not too late. These dark corridors are not your true home. There is a world above, a magnificent universe to which you can return if you have the courage. He who possesses this sword possesses the power of truth. Find the blade, and you will find your freedom.
Well, this is where you can see like the Joseph Campbell stamp right on the movie. The chosen one will now run into the wizard, literally in this case. It's not Obi-Wan's ghost, but it kind of should be. And then
someone doing an attempt at a Christopher Lee.
Okay. And it's funny because thinking of sound-alikes, I had the main character at times, if you close your eyes, I swear to God, it sounded a bit like Matthew Broderick. So I'm like, is that Ferris? Zygon sounded a little bit, thinking about like Battle Beyond the Stars, he sounded a little bit like John Saxon to me.
Okay.
Just because there was like that like evil bad guy kind of tone in his voice, and the voice actor for that did a very good job.
He did, but we're crossing all kinds of wires here, Bernie. It's incredible because I'm gonna toss out a name for Zaxxon, Zagnut, Zygote, whatever his name is. Once I say it, you're not going to be able to hear anyone else's voice when you think of it. But I thought he sounded like Ryan Reynolds doing Van Wilder.
I can see that. Yes.
And when the Han Solo stand-in Dag shows up, I'm like, okay, so here's John Saxon wearing a Marty McFly vest, and he sounds like Norm Macdonald.
He would have 1,000% been played by John Saxon in like the Roger Corman produced live action version of this movie.
Yes. I read that not who they had in mind to do the voice acting, because there's no way, but who they envisioned was Burt Reynolds. And that makes a lot of sense.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
Anything in the plot that was interesting to you?
I wrote the phrase, "what is happening?" conservatively 6 times while watching this. And it does kind of get it back around to making some kind of sense, but there's stuff, I will say, like this movie just kind of starts moving. And it's just like one action piece after another until you get around the hour mark when Orin meets up with, I'm not going to remember her name, but new girlfriend, Adriana, something like that.
Yes, Princess Leia with the hair and the outfit, but not Princess Leia.
Yes, and he is rescued by her, and her robot gets taken back to the palace because her father is like the governor or the king, whatever. He kind of runs the system that they're in. And then there's a little bit of exposition that goes on, but until that point, it's really just like animated set piece after animated set piece, and it just goes. I had to laugh at one point when Orin survives the initial encounter with Zaxxon. Elon is killed. He escapes. He's got like a laser drill. He's got a satchel of water, and he's got a loaf of bread. And he's like, dig up. I'm going to dig up. And he just starts lasering away at the ceiling of the mine. And I for a moment, I'm like, are we going to get like an hour and 15 minutes of just a continual montage of him just sitting lasering away? And then this dummy, he gets a little discouraged at one point, has no water left, and then just throws his water satchel like into the abyss. Like, come on, guy, what are you doing?
And then down goes the drill too, the laser drill. He loses everything.
Gets lost shortly after that. He gets attacked by like blood-sucking leeches at one point that
were conservatively
creepy.
They were kind of creepy.
Yeah, definitely very creepy. Like they just attach themselves to him while he's sleeping and just immediately go from like a light pink to like bright red as they start removing the blood from him. Conservatively, like 16, 17 gallons of blood that gets removed from him. He wakes up
That's fair.
and knocks them all off and is not even lightheaded. So, more power to Orin. Like he's able to just quickly bounce back from rapid blood loss.
He gets out and gets to the surface to realize that it's not hell. It's actually a bit idyllic. Like it's kind of a utopia, at least for him, who grew up in mine world. And he sees water and swamps, sees his reflection, and it's a bit overwhelming. So then you get that creepy man droid scene where
I thought that was really that was like one of the highlights I thought of the movie.
Yes.
I thought that was pretty inventive. Those characters or those man droids were going to play a more central role than they really ended up doing. But at least it showed to me from an animation standpoint and from a drawing standpoint, there's some decent creative ideas going on there.
Sure.
We're saying man droids. These are kind of like cyborgs that have pieces of human anatomy, but they've kind of been stitched together with random, metallic parts. And one has like a clip, almost like a scissor like hand type thing.
Yep.
And
that heavy metal influence that comes in because they feel very grungy. They have the lines like, I want his hair, I'll wear his feet.
I want his hair. Oh, let go. I get his arm.
Get your claws off him, you greedy swamp scum. Maybe the freshy boy doesn't want to give up his body parts. Do you?
No.
Well, that's just too bad. Because we're going to take him anyway.
Again, folks, PG, rated PG. The leader, as they're kind of fighting for Orin's body parts, he rips off one of his like buddy's arm, and you kind of see it's not blood, but like some sort of fluid into the air. Okay, this is already kind of creepy, and now you have this sort of body horror, and then eventually the lady gets cut in half by Orin's lightsaber kind of thing, the sword with no blade. She gets cut in half. You see her on the ground, literally in two halves. Just that whole scene, the whole thing. And then to have the Han Solo wannabe and Dag kind of come in, and he saves Orin by shooting the mandroids in half with his blaster. And they're just like these balls of blood on the ground. This is his introduction to the surface, to the world. Really hardcore visually. And of course, since Dag realizes that the kid's got a kyber crystal, some sort of a crystal from the mine world. If you've never seen this, you've seen this. You've seen the elements. You've seen the pieces, where they end up going, like you said, to the one planet. It is called Toga Togo, because the line from Dag is, "Welcome to Toga Togo, the thickest den of thieves this side of Bordegon."
Yeah, you will never find a more wretched den of thieves and scum and villainy. Like, okay, come on. Could you?
Yep.
It wouldn't have taken that much more effort to try to disguise it a little bit, guys. Let's put some effort in here.
And that's in between all of those little things where Dag's spaceship, literally, when the thrusters kick in, they just took the Millennium Falcon sound, right? When it was making turns.
Similar, yeah.
I'm just picturing that someone in the production studio went to Sears, bought the Millennium Falcon that made the noise, and they literally just put the microphone next to it, recorded it, and then you get the when Dag saves Orin from those mandroids, and instead of calling him a nerf herder, he just keeps calling him Water Snake. Dag's computer, I swear to God, it's basically just C-3PO, right? It's got the attitude, the snarkiness.
Yes. The next female character that is introduced, and this is where we can get into robot ass fetishes, I guess. That's the next female character we're introduced, and the robot's got this attitude, and it's very sassy. Yes. And literally the first shot of it, the robot's bent over, and you're just looking at its posterior, and then it stands up. It's holding reams of paper, yes. And Dag is attacking the facility, stealing some of the crystals or something. I don't remember. Mm-hmm. With all the chaos going on, she drops the papers, and then they have the whole encounter with Zagnut, and so just pick a Z word of your choice, and you're close. And he takes the robot as kind of protection / collateral /
human shield.
Yeah, the robot's giving him attitude, but then it just gets weird and creepy. and that he's like, I've got to reprogram her so that she's not like so sassy. And he's talking to the C-3PO, his own, computer that basically flies the ship. And the computer's like embarrassed, like it has to be reprogrammed in a sensitive area. And he's like, well, where is it? He's like, in the posterior. And then they actually take the time to do a scene of him like opening up the panel.
Arthur, where the hell are the personality circuits on these G2 fembots?
According to the internal schematics manual of the G2 class government service fembot, all personal characteristic circuits are located in her... You're definitely looking in the wrong place.
Well, where are they?
They're in her posterior.
You wouldn't dare. Help! 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 What?
He literally opens up her like butt chassis to kind of expose the wires to do his reprogramming, but he puts a piece of tape over the fembot's mouth. Yes. And she starts kind of begging him to stop and say, like, you wouldn't dare. He does the reprogramming. And then, like you said, she starts turning into this sort of sensual robot that flirts with Dag.
There. That should do it.
Hi.
That's more like it.
Has anyone ever told you that you're awfully cute for a meat body?
For all the talk that we can do about, well, it's 1985, it's a different time, it's this, it's that. It's like, you cannot watch that scene now and just like scratch your head and want to immediately take a shower.
And there's other moments like when they end up going on the Tatooine wannabe in Tagatoga or Toga or Toga Party, whatever it is. They meet the Jabba the Hutt type character who's got seemingly like a harem and his henchmen. And Dag shows up and says, hey, I've got this crystal and I'll, obviously, give you a bunch of money for it. So he's like, yeah, meet me like tomorrow in the desert. He's right before he leaves the tent from this Jabba the Hutt guy. The Jabba the Hutt guy's like, oh, and by the way, some of my guys saw you in town and you were hanging out with a little kid, with a young boy. And he's like, oh, do my girls not excite you anymore? The Jabba the Hutt character guy says to Dag. Dag doesn't respond. I think he just kind of leaves and he's like, tomorrow, meet me in the desert. But even a line like that is literally a throwaway in the scene.
It's like a weird character arc for the Dag guy who is like, he's like Han Solo to a T, like out for himself, mercenary, just wants to make money, literally tries to sell the female robot at auction so that he can make even more money. Orin, comes along and is like, oh, this is horrible. And then basically not knowing how auctions work, just outbids everyone to buy her back just as Dag shows up again. But he starts to have a change of heart. So it's because he pays, to get Orin out of debt because now he's owned by the auction master because he doesn't have the money to pay for it, obviously. The auction master voiced by John Muschetta, I believe, who, if anyone
Micro Machine Man. That's
Micro
right.
Machine, yes. So there's that. And then this all culminates at the end of the movie when Dag kisses the female robot and gets like electrocuted slightly. There's all kinds of weird shit going on with that. And I don't want to talk about it anymore.
I don't want to see what happens in that sequel. They showed us enough. We saw too much. We literally flew too close to the sun with the Millennium Falcon sound in the background. That's what it was. Did not need to see that. That was another part where at the very end, these little starflies, and one of them basically is essentially Tinkerbell, right? Like from Peter Pan. Yeah. That's just kind of flying around, helps them get out of the prison of Zygon, who ends up being, as much as he's a Darth Vader type character who has like this mining side hustle thing going on, as he is also a commissioner. Like you mentioned, the Princess Aviana is like, oh, hey, Commissioner Zygon, who I have, no suspicion of being a bad guy, when Orin's like, oh no, he's the bad guy. He's the one that's been enslaving our people and having us dig for these crystals. It's after Zygon and his horde of droids are defeated, all the stormtroopers are thrown into the lava. You get the last scene where the starfly kind of reveals itself with other starflies, and they tend to be like, they're basically just multiple Obi-Wans, right? Mm-hmm. And then Christopher Lee kicks back in. All of a sudden, you realize that they're telling Orin he can leave his human form and leave with them.
You have done admirably, young Orin. We welcome you as an honored member of the Kaka. You are free to leave your human form and come with us.
Yes. Not yet. I'd like to stretch my legs for a few decades.
The choice is yours.
Because he is one of them. He is the Kaka, which again, like, dear Lord, I mean, seriously, you couldn't think of like the chosen one.
Let's wordsmith a little bit more.
Kaka has returned. Kakan.
Sure. So he's like, no. Like, I'm going to stick around. You know, I just met this girl, Princess Aviana, met Dag, who's going to show me all about fembots. So I'm going to stick around in this human form for a few more decades before I, you know, as the Kaka, decide to turn into a starflyer, whatever the hell is going on. And again, out of nowhere, he has the power to heal his brother who's been blind his whole life, or sister. We don't know. That haircut is a little mysterious. We can't fully tell.
Yeah, and you know, and just a word about the Princess Ariana, whatever her name is,
Aviana. Yep, it's one of those waters, one of those bottled waters.
Oh yeah, nice, good. No, that's how I'll remember it. She falls in love with Orin in what has to be like at most 20 minutes, not just screen time, like like world time. And she's crying because they get captured, and she's like, "It's all my fault. Because I wanted to be with you, and and she doesn't get out the words "I love you," but you know that's what she's going to say. And I'm like, like, lady, you don't know how dumb this guy is. You've just met him. Like, Orin does some pretty dumb shit. And to your point about the Tinkerbells, literally save the day. Like, if they're not around, Orin, Dag, everyone is going to die because they get captured repeatedly. They don't really do a ton of saving the day. They basically just rely on the Tinkerbell to show up to kind of point them, you know, oh, hey, there's a bomb hidden in the in the reward money here. Oh, hey, here's the button you need to press to you know, Deus Ex Machina, blow up the entire robot fleet.
That's right. They don't have a Death Star, but they have a bunch of missiles in Zygon's fleet, and they're going to go destroy Orin's planet or something. It's something like that. Again, like, the movie is not that clear always on what's going on for a movie that was animated and took, I have to imagine, an army of people to make. I was going to ask you though, did you get the Earth reference that Zygon made? Yeah.
No.
So they reveal that there's like a galactic bureaucracy, right? That the princess is a part of, that Zygon is a part of as a commissioner. He's a robot. And after that reveal, he basically shares that, you know, his like idea is basically evolution, right? Like, it's time for man to step aside and robots to kind of take over. He's been reprogramming all the mining robots to basically now be his like droid army. But he throws out a line that mentions Earth in a roundabout way.
Thousands of years ago, on some obscure planet, a primitive chess computer was the first inorganic mind to beat man. In a few hours, I will be calling checkmate in the last such game the humans and their kind will ever play.
It's never really fully formed in the movie. There's like a legend of a robot named Nexus that seems to be kind of like a harbinger of doom type that Aviana quickly mentions. Okay, so all right, so Zygon, now that we know he's the robot, he's Nexus. Okay, so he's supposed to be kind of like the apocalypse, the harbinger of doom for mankind or humans in space here. Okay, cool. He's survived 1,200 years with this like illegal, unknown mining world, you know, trying to get a bunch of resources to build his army. But then he makes the comment that thousands of years ago, that, and to kind of reference the evolution of robots and why they're better than humanity. He's like, yeah, thousands of years ago on an obscure planet, a computer beat a human in chess. And that was just the beginning. And I was like, whoa, but it was such a throwaway. So wait, that means like in this mythology and this lore, Earth exists. That's kind of cool, which again, very different from Star Wars, where it's, you know, a galaxy far, far away. You know, is it far away from Earth? Who knows? Who cares? That's a lot more fun than this movie.
Yes.
Was there anything in the 3D piece? Because again, this was, like I mentioned before, when we see some of these movies, we make our list. And if it's not a snake or an arrow or a laser blast or something where it's kind of obvious to us because the copy that's been uploaded to YouTube or that's been made available on Tubi or Amazon or whatever it is has some artifacting. So we can kind of see where a scene looks a little blurry, glossy. Well, that's it. Like, that's where the effect was. And if you had the glasses on and you were watching it at the drive-in at the time, that's when you would see the arrow shooting across you at the screen or something like that. Yeah. This one, way harder, at least for me, to pin out what those moments were, because there were a lot of moments that, like you said, laser whip coming at you, hand lunging at you, blood-filled slug being tossed at the screen, mandroids like reaching and kind of being grabby. I'm guessing that was in 3D.
Yeah, those were the only things that I really picked up on. Like I said, like you mentioned, some of the artifacting, and they were like, it was almost like there was like a stroke around like the characters in some scenes. It was like almost like a dark. That's the best way that I can describe it. So it was like, okay, so it, again, like for depth of field perspective, like that might have been interesting because they're kind of set off on the background art a little bit, and same thing with some of the ships.
There was that scene where they were flying in the desert and they were kind of doing the chase scene with Arthur and the Fembot after they were able to get out of the jungle moon of Endor or whatever jungle planet that was, and they kind of fly away, and it felt like the caverns that they were flying through, there were foreground and background elements because they had a little bit of that 3D tinge to them. I'm like, oh, that would have been cool to see the ships kind of going in and out of the, because of that depth of field.
Mm-hmm. The best, you citing a contemporary source, I was able to track down the episode of Siskel and Ebert where they review this movie. Who knew? It actually got a review on Siskel and Ebert.
Get your cardboard 3D glasses out because we're going to see a 3D animated cartoon.
Starchaser also rips off a lot of Star Wars. I mean, a real lot of Star Wars. There could be a suit here. The story is involving three youngish characters battling the forces of evil in the universe, and you can see the similarity with Star Wars, where the Luke Skywalker-type boy is helped by a hard-bitten Harrison Ford Han Solo type as they battle sort of a gray Darth Vader-type villain. The little computer that talks, the light sword instead of a lightsaber. That wasn't a particularly thrilling scene, and that's my reaction to most of Starchaser. Yes, for kids who are addicted to Saturday morning robot, sword, and sorcery adventures, I guess this film is a step up in production values. And as for the 3D effects, they're not as bad as in Jaws 3D, but that isn't saying much. And as I wore the glasses that they hand out to the theater, frankly, it just made the movie and me get a little bit more tired as it went on.
Thank you very much, Gene. I really appreciate
What did you like about Starchaser?
I didn't like very much about Starchaser. One of the things I liked was the fact that animated 3D looks better than ordinary 3D because they can pour more brightness into the screen, which comes back at you, and also the edges are sharper. I've never really seen a 3D picture that I thought worked, and I thought this movie came closer in terms of the effect than any other 3D movie I've ever seen. On the other hand, the story was pretty routine. The action wasn't so great, and if it were in 2D, it would have never been able to get a theatrical release.
I think that's the test. Would it work in 2D? If it would work in 2D, then 3D will make it marginally better, but this wouldn't work in 2D.
When I looked up Steve Hahn, who directed this, like you mentioned, he's been an animator. He had that the animation studio. He'd worked on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Alvin and the Chipmunks, Ghostbusters, Silverhawks, Care Bears. He worked on, ironically enough, Star Wars Droids. And also, just because I want to be a completionist, he did work on Mr. T and Chuck Norris Karate Commandos. So,
wow.
Because his animation studio was working on so many of these like Saturday and after school cartoon series, he wanted to keep his studio, I guess, continually working. And that's where, like you mentioned, like Jeffrey Scott, who'd worked on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with him at some point and Muppet Babies, he'd served as a writer on shows that Hahn was working on the animation for. And they collaborated on this movie that was, I guess, initially called Escape to the Stars. That was the foundation for Starchaser. So that's kind of like the motivation behind it, but still in that way where a lot of those animated movies that aren't Disney, something obviously more mature like Lord of the Rings and Fire and Ice, like they have no connection to Saturday mornings or after school. They're certainly more mature in content. You think about Lucas, right? And like how he was influenced so much by those 40s Flash Gordon serials. And the people who saw that were probably faintly aware of the 40s Flash Gordon pulp serials to begin with. So you see Star Wars, and it's got to pretty much be not only imaginative, but like unique, because you haven't seen anything like this. So it's kind of hard when if you're not doing something that's more interesting and you're at this point kind of like a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy, like you're going to have to do something different, because if the best thing you can say is like it's the animated version of Star Wars, it's not enough. Like you're going to have to do something to differentiate itself from the thing it was heavily influenced by.
Yeah, or you're going to have to do like a really, really good carbon copy of Star Wars in animated form, so that you're kind of like, this is kind of on the nose, but what they're doing is really well done. I don't know how else, other than just taking it in a completely original vein.
Well, I think maybe to prove your point, Spaceballs, it takes Star Wars, but in a unique vein, in a comedic tone, in a way that only Mel Brooks can. But because you've seen Star Wars, the jokes are kind of funnier, I think, in Spaceballs, because you're like, I get the reference.
Again, like it's on the nose without being interesting enough. And sometimes maybe that's all you want it to be, and that's enough. I'm not going to be overly critical of that, because there's space for stuff that's just trying to rip something off and doing something. And it sounded like from the animation standpoint, this was a real labor of love to not just produce something animation, but like we're going to do it in 3D, and this has never been done before. So there was a lot of learning and trying to figure out how to make this work. So just the fact that this came out and was in existence sounds like it was a triumph of sorts. It's just from an entertainment standpoint, I try to put myself in the shoes of my self in 1985, and if I had seen this in the theater, how much I would have enjoyed it. I don't know that it would have been something that stuck with me.
On face value, like you said, labor of love, the money is there. You can see like the money is on the screen. Like the animation is very fluid. The effects are there. The 3D, let alone the thing that maybe we're giving it short shrift on is, again, CGI in 1985, where you can tell the spaceships at time seem to be computer rendered images and not cell shaded cell drawings. If you can kind of get past the fact that it's hard, if you get past it, it's not Star Wars, even though at times it's blatantly influenced by Star Wars on its own. It's a good looking movie. It's entertaining. It's escapist. It's fun. Anything that's sci-fi, space opera, like I'm in for, I'm willing to give it a watch. Even things like Star Crash or Battle Beyond the Stars. This isn't like that, but right. I can wholeheartedly appreciate the production, like you said, the labor of love that this is. It's just so hard to look past the Star Wars when it's like, man, if you guys had not thrown that in there, would this have been more memorable? I don't know. That's the thing with a lot of these movies, especially these first time watches for you, or in this case, just second time watch for me. Yeah, there's probably a reason that we haven't stumbled onto these movies so far, especially for two folks that have watched a lot of movies. Yeah, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with the... Or the robot in the ass, some might say. Yes. Hit the nail on the head, and the robot does get hit in the ass with a laser bolt at one point and just deflects right off. So, I think what hurts this movie, aside from just the fact that there are blatant Star Wars references, it's that they're really not earned. We're going to light speed. It's just dropped on us at that moment. Same thing with like the Ion M engines, and all of a sudden we're caught in a tractor beam. Like all these things are introduced in the final act that there could be no payoff, because we haven't known that this is part of the universe up until that point. So it's just like, okay, well, another Star Wars reference. Cool. Yeah. We know how it works, but it robs the world building. And I think there is some decent world building in this movie. Like, who doesn't like a Mos Eisley type spaceport where there's all these different alien types and spaceships around, and who knows what's around the next corner? There's stuff there that I think, had they explored a bit more, you could have built some interesting worlds there. I mean, there's some interesting concepts and ideas. It just doesn't go anywhere. And as we talked about, stuff happens. You kind of get where it's going, but it's also still kind of confusing, but it's not confusing to the point where you're trying to rack your brain to figure it out. You're just kind of like, So, maybe some missed opportunities there. I did see at the very end, when I did catch some of the credits, the storyboard artists and layout artists, they had a few names that I did catch. Boyd Kirkland. And just because I'm such a big fan of Batman the Animated Series, he did work on that. He worked on Little Nemo, G.I. Joe. Frank Parr also worked on Batman the Animated Series and on Gargoyles. And Bill Croyer, who I believe I saw he was a director of one of the Fern Gully movies, but he also worked on Tron and kind of dabbled between animated features and special effects and computer generated imagery. My guess is like, I bet if we basically Googled the names of every storyboard and layout artist, that we probably found that one, they worked on a lot of different productions that Steve Hahn's studio worked on. And then two, that they probably took this experience, and then the movies we see after this are probably the beneficiaries of their experience of having worked on Starchaser.
Yeah, maybe this was a proving ground for the staff in many ways. It certainly sounds like it was a learning experience, and I don't know if it was the most enjoyable experience from all parties. Mm-hmm. But again, wild how just to have the idea, not just to do the animation, to do it in 3D, which hadn't been done before, to figure out the technology, to bring in computer animation that hadn't been done before, back in the early to mid 80s. Mm-hmm. That's kind of wild in and of itself. I was going to ask you, I saw that Andrew Belling wrote the music for this. He also did the music for Bakshi's Wizards.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Any thoughts on the score for this? Anything memorable or anything that sticks out for you?
There were a few John Williams-like moments, right? Like I think there was a part where Zygon walks in and it very much had a, Darth Vader's Imperial March type feel to it. I think for the most part, it sounded like a lot of those movies that Battle Beyond the Stars and Starchaser, it sounded like that. And in some ways, like you may hear it and be like, oh, that's not a compliment. No, I'm actually saying like it sounded okay. It sounded like Star Wars Light. Yeah, same. I don't think there was any stinger or any piece that was exceptionally memorable, but I thought it had a good mix of like grandiose, epic strings, and there was a synth element to it as well. There are parts where it was almost kind of like a droning synth score with certain things that I actually thought it complemented each other well. I mean, certainly for the time, a lot of synthesizers in early to mid 80s music, and I thought they used that and it balanced off of, the more stirring string stuff of like, this is an epic journey and here's our hero and will he save the day type stuff. So nothing blowing me away, but again, like you, I think the score was solid. I think that's everything we got on Starchaser, Pete. What do you think? I got one more thing. Just remember, you cannot spell Starchaser without ass. And that's how we end that. That's it right there.